Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal hemmed in by schemes, stares, and whispered judgments in every corner of Port Charles's polished social world. Nina found herself suffocating in a power structure that was once her playground, but had now become her prison. The opulence, the politics, the strategy, everything she had mastered in her quest for acceptance, had turned against her. And at the heart of it all was a secret she once believed gave her power: her affair with Drew. What began as an escape, something reckless and deeply personal that made her feel alive after years of emotional exile, was now unraveling every thread of her carefully constructed life. The affair, hidden in shadows, protected in silence, was never meant to surface. But secrets in Port Charles have a way of clawing out into the light, especially when Tracy Quartermain decides it's time. Tracy was no longer a peripheral threat whispering in back rooms and board meetings. She had become a full-blown adversary, moving with precise cruelty, sharpening her words and strategies like weapons honed over decades of family warfare. She didn't just disapprove of Nina, she despised her, seeing her not as a threat to be tolerated, but as a contagion to be purged. She framed Nina's relationship with Drew as not only inappropriate but inherently destabilizing, morally, professionally, and most dangerously, socially. And when Tracy began orchestrating a narrative that painted Nina as a manipulative opportunist hellbent on seducing her way into family power, the dominoes began to fall. First came murmurs in the boardroom. Then icy receptions at events. Then Willow's walls, which had only just begun to lower after months of fragile effort, came crashing down once more. Faced with complete social excommunication, Nina began scanning her surroundings with the frantic gaze of someone cornered. She didn't need redemption, she needed leverage. And that's when she turned to Cody Bell. He was unpredictable, untethered, and just far enough removed from the elite circles to serve as the perfect wild card. His presence in Christina's seduction plot with Ava had made him the center of quiet scandals. But more importantly, he had been present the night things nearly unraveled at the Brown Dog Bar, where the tension between lies and truth was so taut it nearly snapped. Cody had heard things. He had seen things. He knew enough about Nina, Drew, Tracy, and their tangled web to change everything. Nina approached him quietly, cautiously, as if she were waking a sleeping dragon she hoped to tame. She didn't offer direct threats, those days were behind her. Instead, she wrapped her proposal in flattery, money, opportunity. What she wanted was clear: Cody would discreetly leak information or plant suspicion that Tracy had manipulated a charity fund or doctored corporate records. Anything plausible enough to warrant an internal investigation and discredit Tracy just long enough for Nina to reset the chessboard. In return, Cody would receive a generous payout, the promise of protection, and a new start. But Cody didn't bite. At least, not immediately. Nina watched in growing dread as his expression shifted not toward intrigue or curiosity, but concern. It wasn't a calculating kind of silence, it was the silence of someone struggling between right and wrong. What she hadn't realized was that Cody, in all his messiness, still carried something she had long buried: a conscience. He wasn't just sitting on knowledge, he was sitting on a moral dilemma. He knew the truth about her affair with Drew, but also about her manipulation of Portia. He suspected her intentions toward Willow were far less maternal than obsessive. And he understood that what Nina was asking him to do wasn't just a game. It was character assassination. It was war. The longer Cody hesitated, the more Nina's carefully maintained composure frayed. The idea that he might refuse her, and worse, expose her, sent her spiraling into a state of psychological collapse. Sleep became impossible. Conversations felt like negotiations. Every phone call, every glance felt threatening. And then came the realization that chilled her to the bone: even if Cody said nothing, the damage was done. The silence itself was a form of betrayal. If he wasn't with her, he was already against her. And so, standing at the precipice of social, professional, and personal ruin, Nina made a decision that shocked even herself: she would confess. Not to Drew. Not to Tracy. But to Willow, there was no strategic calculus left. No angle to play. It was simply time. She found Willow one evening at the hospital, exhausted after a long shift, the kind of moment Nina had once told herself she would never intrude upon again. But there she stood. Uninvited, unsteady, but resolute. Her voice cracked as she spoke, not with manipulation, but with weight. She told Willow everything, the affair with Drew, the bribes, the attempts to manipulate Portia into silence, and the unbearable obsession that had driven her to sabotage what little trust she and Willow had built. She spoke of grief, how losing Nellie had created a void she tried to fill with lies. How the idea of being Willow's mother had become her only beacon, and how she clung to it until it distorted everything. Willow listened, her expression unreadable, but her eyes told the story. Shock. Hurt. And a deep, aching sadness. Not because Nina had deceived her again, but because she finally told the truth, and it was too late. The chasm between them had grown so vast, not even sincerity could bridge it. But worse was still to come. Within hours, Drew found out. Whether Cody cracked under guilt or Tracy had already set a trap, Nina's confession to Willow became ammunition for a far larger implosion. Drew confronted her with a fury Nina had never seen from him. He wasn't just angry, he was betrayed, gutted. To him, their relationship had been a rare space of honesty in a town of masks. But to learn it had been weaponized, even unintentionally, was a devastation too great to ignore. He accused her of using him, not for affection, but for advantage. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps, in her desperation, Nina had stopped recognizing the difference. From that point forward, everything fell apart with stunning speed. Drew cut off all contact, refusing even to hear her apologies. Willow withdrew entirely, responding only in sterile, brief texts regarding legal custody matters. The Quartermain board, sensing Nina's waning support, quietly began distancing themselves. Her alliances evaporated overnight. Even her former allies grew cold. Nina was no longer the powerful woman in the room. She was the liability everyone feared being seen with. And through it all, Tracy never lifted a finger. She didn't have to. Nina had detonated the bomb herself. In her quest to protect love, family, and reputation, she had scorched every bridge in her path. Now, alone and stripped of pretense, Nina walked through Port Charles as a ghost. A woman defined not by her scandals, but by her solitude. A mother without a daughter. A lover without love. A fighter without a cause. For all her cunning, her power, her hunger, she had forgotten the one truth Port Charles always enforces: secrets never stay buried, and redemption comes only to those who learn the cost of truth before it's too late. Tracy, meanwhile, was far from the diminished adversary Nina had so naively hoped to outmaneuver. If anything, she was ascending in strength and resolve, armed now with irrefutable confirmation of what she had long suspected. Nina's moves were not born of wisdom or grace, but of desperation, manipulation, and a profound inability to navigate power without deception. The damning confirmation came, of all people, from Cody. He had wrestled silently with his conscience, but in the end, the weight of Nina's proposition, the bribe, the lies, the quiet coercion, became too heavy to bear. In a moment that would tilt the balance of the entire war, Cody approached Tracy in private and told her everything. Not only did he expose Nina's attempted manipulation, but he made clear the nature of her schemes: dishonest, reckless, and symptomatic of a woman drowning beneath her own ambitions. For Tracy, it was a triumph not simply because she had bested her rival, but because she now had proof that Nina wasn't just a threat, she was unstable, dangerous, and willing to bend anyone or anything in her path to regain control. The truth wasn't just ammunition, it was validation. Tracy didn't need to smear Nina with half-truths or insinuations. She now held the moral high ground and the documentation to back it. Armed with this knowledge, Tracy did not unleash a public tirade or orchestrate an explosive confrontation. She didn't need to. She let the information trickle into the veins of the Quartermain family network like a slow, potent poison. One by one, the whispers began. It started subtly. Board members growing distant, formerly warm greetings replaced by chilly nods, social invitations that never came. But the real shift happened behind the closed doors of Quartermain gatherings. During charity galas and corporate luncheons, in the confines of drawing rooms and dinner tables, Nina's name began to surface, never shouted, never overt, but always present, always coded in caution and disapproval. She was now spoken of in hushed tones, as a cautionary tale rather than a peer. Her legacy, once tenuously constructed on second chances and personal reinvention, was dissolving under the weight of her exposed tactics. And worse still, she felt it happening but could do nothing to stop it. It wasn't a fall from grace, it was a slow erosion, a public unspooling of her identity in a city where memory was long and forgiveness was scarce. As this social tide turned, Nina found herself increasingly isolated, both physically and emotionally. Her calls were returned late, her presence at events more tolerated than welcomed. Where she once commanded a room, she now lingered on its edges, uncertain whether to speak or stay silent. She had gambled on secrecy, on Cody's silence, on her ability to stay 2 steps ahead, and lost. And now she was paying not with scandal, but with irrelevance. But while the world around Nina turned colder, it was Willow's quiet withdrawal that struck the deepest chord. Though deeply wounded by Nina's betrayals, Willow still tried to hold on to the last strands of compassion. She did not publicly condemn her mother. She did not lash out or seek retribution. Instead, she simply distanced herself, slowly but definitively, allowing the space between them to widen into a chasm that Nina could not cross. Willow's silence was more painful than any confrontation could have been. It wasn't vengeful. It was mournful, a quiet acknowledgement that some wounds are too deep to bandage with apologies, especially when they've been inflicted repeatedly by someone who claims to love you. Despite everything, Willow tried to keep a portion of her heart open, out of decency, out of shared history, perhaps even out of guilt. But forgiveness was not something she could grant on command, not this time. The hurt had calcified into something more permanent. Nina hadn't just broken trust. She had turned motherhood into a performance, love into currency, and remorse into strategy. And even though Willow saw the broken woman underneath the chaos, the line between sympathy and self-preservation had become too sharp to ignore. For Nina, the consequences were not explosive or theatrical. They were quieter, more corrosive, more enduring. Each day brought a new realization of how deeply she had alienated herself. Each time she walked into a room and felt conversations falter, eyes shift, or alliances dissolve, she was reminded that trust once shattered is nearly impossible to rebuild. Her name had become synonymous with deceit, not by scandalous headlines, but by unspoken consensus. She was not chased from power, but left behind by it, forgotten in the shadows where once she had stood in the spotlight. And Tracy? She simply watched. She didn't need to twist the knife. The damage was self-inflicted. All Tracy had to do was wait, and when the truth surfaced, she merely stepped aside and let the world recalibrate around it. Her point had been made without raising her voice. She had proven that character, not cunning, was what endured in Port Charles. In the end, Nina was left to wander through a world that no longer welcomed her, bearing the weight of her decisions and the emptiness of rooms where once she was embraced. She had spent so long trying to control the narrative, to manipulate reality to fit her desires, that she forgot the simple power of truth, and how devastating it could be when used not as a weapon, but as a mirror. Meanwhile, Cody, a man who had always lived by instinct, whim, and the temporary comforts of impulsive choices, found himself grappling with a weight he never expected to carry. For years, Cody had floated through Port Charles without a defined center. He was a drifter of circumstance, someone who dipped his toes into everyone else's drama without ever truly getting wet himself. But Nina's proposition, and his subsequent refusal to play along, had changed that. What once felt like freedom, the ability to stay detached from consequences, now transformed into a burden of moral responsibility. Cody had crossed an invisible threshold. By choosing not to sell out Tracy, by walking away from the promise of easy money and influence, he had unwittingly stepped into the heart of a storm he couldn't simply ride out. The choice not to accept Nina's offer didn't come without cost. Though her threats were never overt, Cody felt the chilling undercurrent of what it meant to defy someone like Nina Reeves. The kind of woman who, when cornered, no longer asked for loyalty, she demanded it. The air around him seemed thicker now, charged with the tension of invisible retaliation. People began to look at him differently, as if he knew more than he let on. Paranoia settled in like a fog. Cody wasn't sure whether his next misstep would cost him his reputation, his safety, or his already fragile relationship with Molly. And that relationship, his one steadying force, was beginning to fracture. Molly, for all her warmth and empathy, could sense something had changed in Cody. She didn't know the details, but she knew enough to realize he was pulling away, retreating into silences he couldn't explain. Cody wanted to tell her everything, to confess what he had been offered and why he had turned it down, but fear held him back. Not fear of judgment, but fear that speaking the truth would drag her into the vortex, making her yet another casualty of Nina's unraveling empire. As the distance between them widened, Cody began to question whether he had made the right decision at all. He had done the morally correct thing, yes, but at what cost? Isolation? Distrust? Regret? Yet even in the face of that uncertainty, Cody held on to one unshakable truth: he had not allowed himself to become a pawn. In a town where backroom deals and whispered betrayals were currency, he had chosen integrity over advantage. He didn't sell his silence, and he didn't barter his conscience. That, he told himself, had to count for something. But for Nina, it was one more loss in a mounting series of collapses. The very moment Cody stepped away, she understood what it meant to be truly abandoned. One by one, the walls around her had fallen. Drew, who once offered her a reckless but thrilling kind of love, had walked away in rage and disappointment. Willow, the daughter she had yearned for with every broken piece of her heart, now regarded her with distant sorrow. And now Cody. The last person who had the power to shield her from Tracy's wrath, had chosen truth over alliance. Nina was out of moves, out of players, out of time. Tracy hadn't needed to destroy her. She hadn't delivered a final blow with cruelty or spectacle. She had simply waited, strategically, patiently, until Nina's own machinations undid her. Tracy's brilliance wasn't in her aggression, it was in her restraint. She allowed Nina to dig her own grave, and then stood back while the town collectively watched her fall in. Nina now stood at the brink of something deeper than disgrace. It was erasure. Not by scandal, but by neglect. No one needed to exile her. She had exiled herself through every decision, every miscalculated step. Her identity, once stitched together from ambition, reinvention, and hard-won respect, was unraveling thread by thread. She no longer inspired sympathy. She was no longer feared. She had become irrelevant. Stripped of her defenses and emptied of pretense, Nina was left alone with the ghosts of every wrong turn. The secrets she once wielded like weapons had transformed into anchors around her soul. The maternal instinct that once drove her to reconnect with Willow had mutated into obsession, distorting her intentions until even the purest hope had turned toxic. Her strategic lies, once delivered with charm and calculation, now echoed in the silence of rooms she could no longer enter. There were no more justifications. No more second chances. Just the raw, unbearable truth of everything she had lost. The most painful realization wasn't that she had failed, it was that she had been the architect of her own downfall. She had wanted so desperately to be seen as a mother, a partner, a woman of influence. But in the pursuit of those roles, she had traded away the very humanity that might have earned them. She had pushed too hard, lied too often, and loved too conditionally. And the city moved on. Port Charles, ever turbulent, didn't stop to mourn her fall. The political wheels kept turning. New alliances formed. Old scandals were replaced by fresh betrayals. Life carried forward with its usual blend of drama, danger, and ambition. But Nina? She lingered at the edge, no longer a player but an observer. A woman watching from the sidelines as the world she had fought to control slipped further and further away. She had once imagined that truth might set her free. But the truth hadn't redeemed her, it had exposed her. Left naked beneath the harsh light of judgment, she saw herself clearly for the first time. Not as a victim. Not even as a villain. But as a woman who had spent too long chasing power, and in the process, had lost the one thing she could never fake, her soul. In the end, Nina stood at the shattered intersection of ambition and consequence, stripped of her illusions, her leverage, and the fragile love she once hoped would save her. She had spent years constructing a version of herself that could survive the scrutiny of Port Charles. Ruthless when needed, charming when convenient, and always just vulnerable enough to inspire sympathy. But beneath the facades and schemes was a woman terrified of being forgotten, of being unloved, of never finding redemption in the eyes of the daughter she lost and the life she could never quite hold on to. Her story was no longer one of resilience, but of erosion, a slow, painful unraveling born not from external cruelty, but from the quiet destructiveness of her own choices. Cody's refusal to compromise his conscience marked a turning point not only for himself, but for Nina, who had come to rely on the manipulation of others as her last line of defense. Drew's fury, Willow's silence, Tracy's patient vengeance, all of it culminated in a devastating reckoning that no calculated apology could undo. And now, as the city churned forward without her, Nina remained a ghost in its periphery, the echoes of her ambition swallowed by the very power structure she once sought to dominate. There were no dramatic exits, no redemption arcs, no grand forgiveness. Just a woman left alone, walking through the ruins of everything she once believed would make her whole.